Hi, and welcome to the Restorative Wellness Clinicians Corner, a video series exclusively for functional health professionals, where we interview the top experts in the latest research, products, tools, and best practices for getting your clients exceptional results. Welcome, everybody. We are so excited for tonight's long-awaited episode of the RWS Clinicians Corner. We have the one and only Dr. Gabrielle Lyon here with us tonight. If you don't know, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon is an accomplished board-certified family physician and a distinguished New York Times bestselling author, lauded for her latest work, Forever Strong, a new science-based strategy for aging well. Her book's exceptional success has also earned her the esteemed titles of the Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestselling author. And if you have not got a copy of this and haven't read it yet, I have my copy right here, totally thumbnailed and marked up and all this good stuff. This you definitely want to put on your must-read list. At the forefront of modern medicine, Dr. Lyon is leading a revolutionary movement focusing on the body's largest organ, skeletal muscle. Her mission is to promote longevity and combat the pervasive threats of obesity, heart disease, and diabetes by optimizing muscle health. Dr. Lyon's rich background encompasses a dual research and clinical fellowship in geriatrics and nutritional sciences at Washington University, complemented by her undergraduate training in nutritional sciences at the University of Illinois. As an authority in the practical application of protein types and levels for health, performance, aging, and disease prevention, she is highly sought after as an educator. And Dr. Lyon, we are absolutely thrilled to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
I would love to start with understanding a little bit more about your personal story and what brought you to this very significant paradigm shift, right? This focus on muscle as the organ of longevity versus this perpetual pursuit that it seems like we've all been on of fat loss, which has been so much the dominant narrative. So what brought you here?
A turn of many, many different events and being at the right place at the right time. My godmother is Liz Lipsky. So I don't know if you know who that is, but she is an OG in the functional medicine space, the group before functional medicine had a name. And I moved in with her when I was 17. I worked for room and board. And during that time, I learned all about nutrition. That changed my perspective on everything. I was lucky, whether it was just worked out that way, that she was my godmother, seems a little crazy. Then I went to undergraduate and I studied human nutrition, vitamin, mineral metabolism. I went to the University of Illinois. I happened to be in the class of Dr. Donald Layman, who is a world-class protein researcher and expert and has mentored me for the last 2 decades. And I knew that nutrition was a pathway that I was going to follow. But for me personally, it wasn't enough. I wanted to do another layer of care, and that led me to medical school.
Wonderful. Now, I love this new perspective that you have introduced to us of the role of muscle so far beyond physical strength, the body's sort of architecture. We've got an audience of practitioners here, so they're very well aware of muscle's vital role for metabolic health. But you take that many steps further than this. You describe muscle as an endocrine organ, specifically talking about the role of myokines. So I would love you to unpack that for us, explain what myokines are, how they influence our overall health.
I would love to. And before I do that, I want to mention a little bit about, because this is a room of practitioners, I want to mention a little bit about where muscle-centric medicine has its birthplace. I was doing my fellowship in geriatrics, and for you guys, that's anyone over the age of 65. I was doing a combination of geriatrics in clinical practice, obesity medicine, so I ran an obesity medicine clinic in the evenings, and clinical research in nutritional sciences. And the project, as a postdoc, every postdoc gets a project. The project that I had put together was looking at the interface between body composition and brain function. And, it was during the time, it was 2015, 2013. And everyone was looking, wow, so long ago. And everyone had started talking about Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes of the brain. And I imaged this woman's brain, and she was in her mid 50s. She had had 3 kids, always put herself last, and she had gone through this cyclical dieting, as you know, we all know too well. And when I imaged her brain looked like the beginning of an Alzheimer's brain. And we all have that one patient or participant or client that changes everything about how we think because we feel so connected to them and we feel that we failed them. And I felt like I failed her. I felt like I failed her in multiple domains. I felt like the medical system as a whole had failed her because she was doing what everyone had told her to do, which was eat less and exercise more. And I couldn't let it go. With my training in muscle health and protein metabolism, I had been taught all about skeletal muscle, for years. And when I went back to my colleagues, the conversation was, how is this still what we're recommending? This idea of the food guide pyramid, which obviously 2013 to 15 wasn't the primary, but it was still the same narrative. And the more I dove into the literature, the more I realized that we had been focusing on the wrong tissue, that we didn't have an obesity problem. And I think that more and more evidence is coming out as we become better and more skilled at looking at skeletal muscle mass, that it's actually the loss of skeletal muscle rather than the gain of adiposity that becomes so impactful for people. And in fact, I remember I was looking at this one paper that I thought was just absolutely fascinating. And it was a cross-sectional study. So it wasn't a randomized controlled trial, but what it did show was that those that insulin resistance, so the lower individuals had of skeletal muscle mass, the greater their insulin resistance was. And for every 10%, there was like a 10% loss of skeletal muscle mass resulted in an 11% increase in insulin resistance. And when you talk about skeletal muscle as the metabolic sink and as the endocrine organ of the body, we have to recognize that it has a very unique place in metabolism. And we're going to get to myokines, but before we do, I think it's important to point out the 3 other very critical aspects that skeletal muscle has. Number 1, it is the primary site for glucose disposal. Whether it is insulin stimulated at rest or through exercise, which is non-insulin dependent, skeletal muscle is the primary site for glucose disposal. As we all know, glucose is toxic at high levels. The body must maintain a certain level of glucose in the bloodstream. The rest must be disposed of. Skeletal muscle, the more healthy skeletal muscle mass you have, the greater your storage unit, number 1. Number 2, skeletal muscle at rest is the primary site for fatty acid oxidation. Skeletal muscle, people will say it is a highly dynamic organ. It's frankly, it's not. When you think about how much of, say, the basal metabolic rate it takes up, it's really just due to its size, but not its activity at rest. At rest, skeletal muscle primary burns fatty acids. So it is the site for lipid oxidation, which is just by nature, because of its size, a large amount. It is also our amino acid reservoir. The body turns over 300 grams of protein a day. 70 grams of that will be muscle. The rest goes to organs, whether it's intestines or liver. And muscle is 1 to 2% per day. So in a total of 50 to 100 days, you've now completely turned over all the skeletal muscle mass in your body. It's a highly plastic tissue and it has a lot of plasticity. And then finally, skeletal muscle as an endocrine organ in which it secretes myokines. And this is interesting because what it does is it creates a inter-organ crosstalk. Essentially, it's the way that skeletal muscle communicates from myokines that affect the brain, from myokines that increase fat oxidation, from myokines that drive carbohydrate metabolism. It is a unappreciated role of skeletal muscle. And quite frankly, it's also called this exercise factor. And the person that really pioneered this is in Copenhagen, and her name is Bente Peterson. One would think, okay, well, what about these myokines? The most famous myokine would be interleukin 6, and this is mostly recognized for its regulatory effect on glucose and lipid oxidation, which I had mentioned. And I don't want to confuse the conversation because it is highly complex. Just, there's hundreds of different myokines, but people will talk about training in a low glycogen state. And training with low glycogen might increase the influence or the release of some of these myokines, which is so fascinating. So, but again, I could go on and on. There's a whole host of things, but I will say this is also important because these are clinicians here. From a clinical perspective, it is unrealistic for us to be measuring myokines in the bloodstream. Myokines, or also depending on the cells in which they are produced from, for example, macrophages, when they are released from macrophages, they are called cytokines. They are pro-inflammatory. We can measure the pro-inflammatory cytokines, whether it's TNF alpha or interleukin 6, but from an exercise perspective, there are too many variables to really define if it is a valuable marker yet from muscle.
Fascinating. Now, this just opens the door into so many other pieces as well. I love that you shared that story about working with this young woman who's, got this, the neurological and cognitive piece. Can you help us make those connections to, muscle directly influencing neurological health? We don't think of that as a relationship in that way, other than, oh, we exercise, it feels good, clear the brain kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first and I think most important and most relevant aspect about physical movement is the skeletal muscle influence. Is when you think about these diseases of metabolism, these diseases like cardiovascular disease, like Alzheimer's, which there are multiple types of Alzheimer's, but there is a component to Alzheimer's that is metabolic in nature. Type 3 diabetes of the brain, whether it's vascular or metabolic, there are direct influences of physical activity. When you think about obesity and diabetes, all of these go back to skeletal muscle. Because again, what we spoke about in the beginning of this interview is that skeletal muscle in and of itself is the metabolic sink of the body. When you train and you do resistance training for anyone listening or watching is not replaceable with any other activity. It is a non-negotiable, and I would recommend individuals do it 2 days a week at minimum to maintain the skeletal tissue that they have. And there's a number of reasons why it becomes critical to do resistance training. But from a cognitive aspect, when you are training, you are working on a multitude of things, from balance to focus to increasing blood flow. All of these things play a role in cognitive health. So there's the brain aspect, but then there's also the metabolic aspect. And from a myokine standpoint, the most famous brain myokine is BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. What exercise does in response to exercise, myokines are released in accordance to intensity and duration, but also we'll just pick BDNF, causes a release of, or exercises causes an increase in capsaicin and irisin, all of which have the potential to influence BDNF in the brain, which is important for neurogenesis.
I want to pick up on this piece around the resistance training. I was saving this question for later, but you've brought it up, so I think let's dive right into it. Particularly in older populations, and in, a lot of our clinicians are working with people who are dealing with very severe chronic illness. So even if they're younger, they might be facing very severe autoimmune disease, or, they're living in a mold environment that they're working through, MCAS, these types of things. So how do you recommend working with these clinical populations? It's one thing the athlete comes to optimize. A conversation is easy, but the conversation with the elderly client, the conversation with somebody who's struggling to kind of get out of bed and walk out the door, how do we, recognizing that this is vitally important and there's clear benefits to it, how do we support them through that process safely?
First of all, what you're bringing up, Margaret, is the most important conversation that we can have. Is a lot of the health space is dominated by, quote, optimization and excellence in athletic performance. from my perspective, from your perspective, it is an extremely valuable, if not the most valuable conversation, is how do we take care of skeletal muscle health outside of human optimization? And what we're really talking about is bringing this piece of skeletal muscle back from the athletic population to a non-negotiable for an aging population. That being said, we have to recognize that sedentary behavior is a disease state. Sedentary behavior, there's a diseasome of inactivity that is not the opposite of exercise. So sedentary behavior is not the opposite of exercise. Sedentary behavior is a disease state, and there's a number of things that happen to an aging population within skeletal muscle. And I'm going to bring up anabolic resistance because this is the most critical piece for the nutritionists on here, for the physicians on here, for the providers on here, is that skeletal muscle, its efficiency of utilizing protein decreases as we age. And that is where much of the work from my mentor, Dr. Donald Lehman, came up with this dosing. The reason that we think about protein in a dose response is primarily, in my mind now, for an aging population. To take this one step further, skeletal muscle is stimulated in two ways. Number one, through resistance training, and number two, through dietary protein. Both of which, when used appropriately, can then allow older muscle to respond like youthful muscle. Whether you are in your 60s or you are in your 20s, with the right dosing and activity, old muscle responds like young muscle. How do we do this, you ask? The good news is back to diet and exercise, but in a different way. The way in which we do this is a younger individual is highly sensitive. They're highly anabolically driven. Their hormones are good. They will respond to 20 grams of dietary protein. Again, I'm talking about high quality protein. I am talking specifically about proteins that contain all our essential amino acids in appropriate doses. And that, for the protein buffs in here, would be 2.5 grams of leucine, which is one of the essential branched chain amino acids. As individuals age, the efficiency of that skeletal muscle goes down. The way in which we measure skeletal muscle health, a biomarker, is something called muscle protein synthetic response. And what this is not done in clinics. You guys wouldn't be doing it. It is done through skeletal muscle biopsy. Not fun. I used to do many of those. They don't feel good either. But essentially, when an appropriate dose of amino acids are given from dietary protein, it will trigger skeletal muscle to begin to go through this process of muscle protein synthesis. When you are young, that is around 1.8 grams of leucine, which would be approximately 20 grams of protein. As you get older, the way in which you overcome this anabolic resistance is you double an aging person's protein. 40 grams of dietary protein from a high quality source will allow that aging muscle to respond as if it was a younger, more youthful muscle. So we see that anabolic response becomes equal. To take it one step further, the thing that we are up against with an aging population is they don't consume a lot of food. They consume less food as they age, whether it's an appetite thing, mastication becomes a problem. The way in which we can get around this for those individuals that are not consuming high amounts of food is that when you pre-treat the meal with resistance training, you sensitize that tissue to respond like a younger tissue with less protein. From a very practical aspect to the provider is, number one, if you can get your patients or clients to eat 40 grams of protein at that first meal to stimulate tissue, amazing. Again, I'm talking about high quality proteins. If they are choosing a lower quality protein, you would want to add in branched chain amino acids or an essential amino acid mix. But then again, we also have to address nutrient density is different. So for an aging population, I think it becomes very important to recognize that these are not interchangeable. If you have someone who doesn't want to increase their dietary protein, they just cannot get it in, then my suggestion is you have them do resistance training. And, I worked on some of these early studies, and I hate to say it, but I will. For untrained individuals, 2 days a week of yoga was enough to pre-sensitize that muscle, which is not that much. It's just providing load, even if it's body load. And that will allow a patient to respond in a way that is very youthful. The graphs are the same. The muscle protein synthetic response is the same.
Now, is there a certain amount of time that you want to make sure, or like a window within which they're consuming that protein post-exercise?
Great question. And what your question is this anabolic window response. And the anabolic window has, I think that this is a complex question. The anabolic window has no importance if someone is young or really well trained. It doesn't really matter. The Society for Sports Nutrition, ISSN, International Society for Sports Nutrition, would say that the 24-hour protein ingestion is what is most important. However, the anabolic window after training, I believe that there is some benefit for an individual who is in their 60s because that tissue is now primed. And would that be 30 minutes to an hour? It could probably be a little bit longer. But my suggestion would be, why wait? Why wait? And that's really how I would approach it. But if we were to say strictly on the evidence, if you're young, it doesn't really matter. The protein and carbohydrates within the next couple meals aren't going to make a difference. But I would say there may be some benefit to compressing that feeding window close to exercise.
You brought up the supplementation question that I was going to ask as well. And definitely when somebody is not doing a complete protein, you can see the real benefit of bringing in essential aminos, branched chain aminos, supplementation. Assuming somebody is, we're all very big believers in real food, whole food, definitely pro animal sources of protein as a very sort of simple way and complete way of getting that full protein in. Assuming somebody is consuming that type of protein, and I'm going to take the age and stage of life out of the equation here. Is there still a significant benefit to be bringing in those targeted types of supports to complement what, just what you can get from real food if somebody's hitting their protein targets?
I would say no. I think that whole foods are best. And the reason why I think that whole foods are best is because of the other low molecular weight, the other low weight molecules like creatine and serine, taurine. So if what I'm hearing you say is that doesn't matter age, they've hit their protein target. What you're saying is, would there be any other benefit to adding in essential amino acids or branched chains? Is that correct? I would say no. And I also would say that you wouldn't want to be giving that to people in between meals. There's this mechanistic target of rapamycin, which is mTOR. It's in all tissues. And the way that the body is set up is it is exquisitely sensitive to amino acids in skeletal muscle. Once you stimulate mTOR in skeletal muscle, it can stay elevated for hours. We don't know exactly because there's other influences and other initiation factors and other factors that are happening like EIF4 and a handful of other pathways that are stimulated. You don't want to continuously stimulate it. I believe that you stimulate it with a protein dose and then you allow it to reset. I don't believe that you should do continuous protein feedings or continuous carbohydrate feedings. And that's why I would say no.
So sticking to that 3, maybe 4 key meals a day, spacing it out. And
I will say, sorry to interrupt you. I will say that the evidence doesn't support 3 meals a day. And I largely blame my mentor for this because the data was taken out of context. So I'd love to clarify this for you, is that basically we talk about 3 meals a day just to manage hunger. The middle meal of the day, the quote 3 meals of 30 grams of protein a day, there's no evidence behind that middle meal. The first meal and the last meal are most critical for skeletal muscle health. That middle meal, the way that we designed it for a muscle-centric perspective, is purely to mitigate the ebbs and flows of blood sugar and hunger. So it allows us to increase total protein throughout the day. Adding in that middle meal is just an additional way to get your protein intake. If an individual's goal was 100 grams of protein and you were doing 3 meals 3 times a day, so you're now at 90, I think that it's actually more advantageous to an aging population. And aging could be anything over 40 if you have that first and that last meal are optimized.
So, okay, I want to ask a clarifying question on that. So let's say the target is 100, there's just simplicity. 100 grams of protein a day. So 50 in the morning, 50 at night, and not worry about it in the middle is more important. Or, okay. So the daily is still important, but let's really think about front loading and then again at the end. Now, and then factoring in, although also that question of the exercise priming pre-dosing. So that can get, based on somebody's daily schedule, get a little complicated. But
so now you actually bring up a nuanced position here, which I think is very, very smart. The 24-hour day or the daily protein intake, if it's high enough, then it really doesn't matter. So let's say a person is having 150 grams of protein. That is above and beyond depending on their size. So if the RDA is set at the minimum of 0.8 grams per kg or 0.37 grams per pound, so that's the minimum to prevent deficiencies. The data, the first really positioning paper of this came out of the ProDage study, and that came out, I think 10 years ago in 2013, so almost 10 years ago. And this actually really discussed that double the RDA, closer to 1.6 grams or 0.7 grams per pound, is more advantageous to support aging. Now, taking a step back, if an individual is eating enough protein, say towards that higher amount, towards 0.7 to 1 gram per pound, do they really need to think about the dosing of it? I would say no. However, the caveat is I wouldn't have them feed 1 meal a day. Because that 1 meal a day, then you're only stimulating that skeletal muscle 1 time a day. But again, if protein is high enough, I'm less concerned about the dosing.
Isn't there a maximum benefit, a certain amount beyond which it does not actually stimulate muscle protein synthesis in terms of the consumption at any one time? What is that number, or does it vary depending on the individual body it's hard for me to imagine sitting here as, 130 pound, I do mostly endurance training. I do my strength training, don't worry. But, compared to, like a big bodybuilder male, like that's going to be a different absorption, a different capacity for muscle protein synthesis, correct?
So the data isn't there yet. The data isn't there for sex differences, or it just hasn't come out yet. I do believe that there is going to be some sex differences, but the data isn't there yet. I will say that from a dosing perspective, the mechanisms above, say, 50 to 55 grams, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, that you'll utilize all the protein. And, again, the body turns over 300 grams of protein a day. 70 of those grams go to muscle. The rest goes through other organs and target tissues. Once you go above 50 to 55 grams, the body will still use that protein for protein turnover. Protein turnover declines with aging. The capacity, the efficiency of protein turnover declines with aging. And so there is benefit, but it's not benefit to the skeletal muscle.
Okay.
And these are really good questions, and they are a bit nuanced. So I appreciate that you're having the conversation, because I think that it clears things up for people.
Well, it's really this is very helpful. It is nuanced. I feel like all of these things are so nuanced, and people want a black and white answer. But especially as clinicians, we need to be able. We see so many different scenarios in front of us, and we want to be able to navigate it and answer the questions too. Having that conversation to convince somebody who has, especially as they get older, has with a small appetite, and we know that protein is extra satiating. I mean, that could be quite a conversation.
And also, according to the NHANES data, 40% of women over the age of 65 are below the RDA. 40% of women over the age of 65 are deficient in dietary protein. And we know that if an individual falls and breaks a hip, that the health outcomes of that are tremendously negative. So,
Absolutely. In terms of measurement, so we're talking very much about the protein intake. What about actual body composition? I'm assuming, checking with patients, with clients, their body composition? Is that one of your main measurements of progress? And do you have certain targets there? Again, it will depend, I'm assuming, on age and gender or sex.
yes. Now let's frame up the question of body composition. We don't have good ways of measuring skeletal muscle mass. DEXA does not measure skeletal muscle mass directly. DEXA will estimate lean body mass, which includes everything. And then skeletal muscle may be 40% of that. DEXA is good at fat and bone. I do think that there is a value in measuring body fat percentages, but for skeletal muscle mass, the ways in which we have and the numbers in which we have, whether it's appendicular skeletal mass index or, you pick it, those are not good. I don't think that any of them are great. And also, it is really based on sarcopenia and frailty, which we don't have a great definition for sarcopenia either. Therefore, I think as some of the work that is utilized, like Hellerstein and Bill Evans at Davis, are working on measuring skeletal muscle mass directly with a tagged creatine. So it's a deuterated creatine, tags all creatine in the body. You test your urine and you'll get a sense of how much muscle mass is there, as opposed to CT, which we can't do, which does a great job, but the radiation and also MRI is not feasible for everybody to follow skeletal muscle mass changes. So I think that, to your original question, I think about skeletal muscle mass health first. And here's how I think about it. I think about it from a functionality perspective. How strong is somebody? Strength is relative, but you have to measure strength. Every single one of my patients is training. They work with a trainer. They are trained to become stronger. They are not training to become better at exercise. Functionality, I have to see progressive improvements. Period, end of story. I also look at metabolic markers.
Like what you just said, that was brilliant. They are training to get stronger, not to get better at exercise, because that is what you see the vast majority, specifically in the older populations. But I mean, across doesn't actually matter age. And that's such an important clarification.
Yes, for everybody. Now I look at so number one, strength. And everybody can always get stronger and everyone can always put on more skeletal muscle mass. Also doesn't matter your age or anything. You can always get stronger. We see 80-year-olds getting stronger. The other important aspect of skeletal muscle is, how do I look at metabolic health? I look at metabolic health from a skeletal muscle mass perspective. Skeletal muscle insulin resistance can manifest decades before we start to see chronic changes in blood sugar. So skeletal muscle mass insulin resistance plays a role in infertility, plays a role in triglyceride levels, plays a role in heart disease, plays a role in all of these metabolic conditions. An individual who is sedentary, by definition, has unhealthy skeletal muscle. What do I look for in blood work to determine if someone has a healthy skeletal muscle? Triglycerides. In a insulin resistant individual, if skeletal muscle is glycogen full, there is no more uptake that's going to be able to happen. And the things that happen within skeletal muscle is you have an increase in ceramides, you have an increase in diacylglycerols, you have an increase in myosteatosis, fat infiltration. And I'm not talking about triglycerides in muscle to be used for oxidation of exercise. I'm not talking about the athlete's paradox. I am talking about fat infiltration that ends up looking like a marbled steak that has not been turned over. When that happens, you will, number one, quickly see an increase in insulin. Fasting insulin levels will be high. Could someone do an oral glucose tolerance test? Yes. Do I have my patients do it? No, I don't need to. So you'll see increase in triglycerides pretty quickly. You will then begin to see, so insulin and triglycerides you'll see first. And then depending, you'll see an increase in blood sugar. But there's a caveat here because individuals on a higher protein diet, it appears that red blood cells seem to live longer. So you'll see higher levels of hemoglobin A1C, maybe 5.7, and you'll also see higher fasting glucose levels. And when I say higher fasting, I mean it could be in the 90s. But insulin will be less than 5, triglycerides will be 100 or less.
I have so many additional questions, and I'm also aware of time. I want to make sure. Also, we will save some time at the end for questions. I see some folks popping questions into the chat. I want to ask about when a higher protein intake is contraindicated, or I should rephrase that question. Is there a time when higher protein intake is contraindicated? I'm thinking very specifically here. You often get pushback, particularly with cancer, any kind of kidney challenges. So are there times when we're really thinking, hey, we're going to proceed with caution here, do some underlying healing work before we focus on this?
This is a very complex question. So, and I'm glad you brought this up. There's kind of two big thoughts that I have on this. So let's say an individual has cancer. Now, number one, we have to determine what kind of cancer do they have. Do they have colon cancer? Do they have breast cancer? Or do they have lung cancer? What kind of cancer do they have, first of all? Second, we have to recognize that when it comes to cancer, cancer cachexia, which is a destruction of skeletal muscle due to its highly catabolic state, the cancer's highly catabolic state, will kill 20% of individuals with cancer. The greater skeletal muscle mass an individual has, the greater their survivability against cancer. Also, potentially, depending, again, this is a very complex conversation. I usually refer people over to Dr. Joe Zundel, who you should definitely have on your clinician's corner. I refer cancer things to him. But the question becomes, what do we care most about now that the individual has cancer? Does chemotherapy tend to work better if an individual has more skeletal muscle, depending on the chemotherapy? Possibly. The next component of that is methionine restriction. Methionine restriction is missing. So vegan diets typically are methionine restricted, and it increases something called, I want to say it's GnR2. It's some kind of stress response. So it's an integrated stress response. And I don't think that GnR2 is the correct. It might be GnRF2. I don't know exactly. But there is a stress response that's an integrated stress response from methionine restriction because that is stressful for the body. In animal models, it seems like there could potentially be some benefit to methionine restriction. However, if you were to ask me what my personal thoughts are, I would say personally, you protect skeletal muscle mass at all costs. We know that that is going to increase survivability.
That makes a lot of sense. And it also, of course, prevention is its own conversation because a lot of people don't come to this work until, their feet are held to the fire, or whatever body part it is held to the fire. But getting this, getting ahead of all of this, really focusing on this before it becomes, before there are those health consequences, obviously is the best strategy. I'm going to take a peek over here into the chat to see if there's some questions to make sure that I see a few of these I've already been able to answer.
It's GCN2. Sorry. So it's GCN2.
GCN2. Okay. So that's with methionine restriction increases GCN2.
Yeah. And again, I want to caution people to get lost in the mechanisms because mechanisms, we're not treating mechanisms, we're treating people. And so it's really this dietary sulfur amino acid restriction and the integrated stress response. So
I'm seeing some questions in here on some of the practicalities, and these are going to be nuances that folks are dealing with either themselves or with clients. So I think they're really important pieces. So Nicole here has a question about what about protein turning into glucose, that gluconeogenesis? What is, how do we have to factor that into this equation?
Wonderful question. And roughly, so there's ketogenic and gluconeogenic amino acids. The ketogenic amino acids are easy to remember, lysine and leucine. The rest are gluconeogenic. Now, this is a complex topic, but roughly every 100 grams of protein, you'll generate 60 grams of glucose. That is not a bad thing. And when we think about what and how do we manage glucose in the body, protein ingestion will cause a insulin response. It is a phase 1 insulin response that is a fraction of the robustness of carbohydrates. Phase 1 insulin response is from preformed insulin. So yes, there is an initial spike, but it is well within normal. The other aspect is you do not require carbohydrates, and you could just have protein and you will generate enough glucose to maintain blood glucose levels. And that's one reason why individuals have higher levels of glucose with lower levels of fasting insulin because of gluconeogenesis. It's one reason why. I'd much rather have my patients get their quote carbohydrates from the protein mechanisms in the body than just utilizing straight carbohydrates. It's a wonderful question. And I would also say that the protein conversation is very complex because while we're just talking about skeletal muscle, there are other reasons why we eat protein, and it's really for these 20 different amino acids. Again, 9 of which are essential, but things like threonine is important for mucin production. Things like arginine, this amino acid is really important for NO2, which is nitric oxide production. So there's a whole host of reasons that are otherwise metabolically diverse from these individual amino acids.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ellen's got a question here about folks that are cholesterol hyperabsorbers, and when they increase their meat consumption in particular, their lipids go way out of balance. How are you recommending and advising in those scenarios?
Not a protein question. This is a overall saturated fat and overall calorie question. So what I typically do, there's nothing inherent around protein that is causing an increase in, say, LDL cholesterol. So these individuals, and I think what this person is talking about is lean mass hyperresponders. I'm not an expert in lean mass hyperresponders. However, from my own clinical practice, I typically don't put patients on high fat diets. I never have. I think that I just don't see a benefit for it in my practice. So what I would do is I switch people to lean sources of protein. We use a company called Certified Piedmontese, which makes, those are like those big buff cows that don't have myostatin inhibition, and they're just really jacked and very lean. So the overall answer would be to restrict the high fatness. And then, of course, we all recognize that dietary cholesterol does not impact blood level cholesterol, and that individuals have a set point for cholesterol for the most part, and that they took the cholesterol indications out of the guidelines in 2015.
Excellent. How are you considering the digestibility and absorption of, of these of protein? I mean, of all nutrients, but we're talking specifically about protein here. We see a lot of hypochlorhydria in our practices. And I will always remember one of my earliest clients who came to me who was eating really well, a lot of clean protein, exercising, training, doing all of the things. And he was very sort of skinny fat. And when we dug into it, he'd been on PPIs for years. And it wasn't until we were able to help him get off of that, do the gut healing, and support his hydrochloric acid secretions to be much more appropriate levels. His transformation, it has never gone away. I mean, I can't believe it was remarkable. It was so fast. And so for him, it was not actually changing his diet at all. It was actually being able to access those nutrients. Are you addressing that?
Yeah. And there's a few ways to address it. So there is a change in gastric juices, whether it's hydrochloric acid. We know that things change as we age. Also, digestion slows down. I have no challenge. So, number one, the form of protein becomes important here. And there's evidence to suggest that ground meats actually absorb better because, which would make sense because the surface area is different. It's already ground up. Adding in something like betaine HCl, I have no issue with. We use a lot of enzymes clinically in our practice. And I think that it's just very, very helpful.
Excellent. Excellent. Sharon has a personal question here. She's saying she's been eating 120 grams of protein a day for a few months with a low carb diet, but is finding weight gain. Her desired weight would be 154 pounds. So, she's wondering, and I'm sure we see this a lot clinically, or not a lot, but sometimes where people will increase that protein intake, and at least sometimes in my experience, it's been initially, and then things have resolved. But how do you address it in these situations, particularly when it's for weight?
Number one, you have to manage the calories. You have to determine. So the thing with protein is because of its influence on skeletal muscle and the machinery, that its thermic effect of food is high. So it's roughly 20%. I've seen numbers less, I've seen numbers higher, which means that, for example, if you had 100 grams of straight, 100 grams or 100 calories of straight protein, or just straight protein, then due to the machinery, you might only get a net calorie of 80 because 20% of that is used for the metabolism. It's not entirely the metabolism, but it's really the effect of skeletal muscle mass. At least that is what myself and my mentor believe. If you have changed to a higher protein diet and you are not losing weight, then the calories are simply too high. And I know that I'm saying that in a very basic framework, but again, I've been doing this for 20 years, and this is what we have found. Could there be an influence of mold? Could there be an influence of Lyme? Could there be an influence in carbohydrate metabolism? Maybe there's effect of GLUT4 on getting glucose into the cells. All of these things, yes. And working on some of these earlier studies, running a weight management clinic, when you control for calories and you increase the percentage of lean proteins, you should be able to lose weight, high quality weight.
Can we talk a little bit more about some other forms of supplementation? So we talked about the essential amino acids, et cetera. You touched very briefly on creatine. That's definitely a big one. What are your go-tos? If I know that, obviously recognizing bioindividuality, there's no one protocol that works for everyone, but are there some favorites that you use regularly with clients, or you recommend, sort of generally speaking, are really good ideas? And is creatine among them, and what others?
Well, number one, so we take off the table dietary protein. The next thing that I think is very important for individuals, again, now I don't know if I can put this into perspective. So let's say that we take protein away, and let's say an individual is eating mostly chicken, fish, and other types of proteins, not red meat. I would definitely add in, are you ready for this? 10 grams of creatine, not 5, but 10 grams of creatine. 5 grams of creatine is excellent for skeletal muscle health, but 10 grams is really important for brain health. And we're going to start to see emerging evidence more and more of this being important. So 10 grams would be something that I love of dietary creatine. Now, of course, I think fatty acids are important, especially for women. Actually, it seems to be more impactful. Omega-3 fatty acids, maybe because of its effect on the ribosomes, but they seem to affect women differently, more impactful than men. Again, I don't know the mechanism of action of this, but Chris McGlory is really the foremost expert in Canada on this. So fish oil for sure. Vitamin D supplementation. There are vitamin D receptors on skeletal muscle. I think that that's very important. There are other things that I really like. Now, I really like, but someone doesn't have to have this, is beta hydroxybutyrate, ketones. Ketones are good for the brain. They're also muscle sparing, and that could be around 10 grams a day. I think that that's really excellent. I think that urolithin A also has been shown to have some benefit. It's a postbiotic 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day. I think that that can be wonderful. And then other kind of I would say that I would stop there is pretty much my go-to. And then depending on if an individual has specific needs. But for me personally, I always use every day. I always use collagen and I always use MCT. Collagen does nothing for muscle, but it does a lot of things for hair and skin. I think that there's, other things that it does, these di and tripeptides that get into the bloodstream. The evidence supports anywhere from 5 to 10 grams, but going higher, I think we just don't have the evidence, but I do. And I think that we're just behind on the evidence. So I think that collagen, MCT, these are two things that I use every day. I love beta hydroxybutyrate. I eat a lot of red meat, so I feel like I don't need creatine, but I certainly recommend people to take that. And I always use electrolytes.
Excellent. I love that I was going to ask very specifically about the exogenous ketones. So I love that you brought up the beta hydroxybutyrate. That's excellent. I've been digging into that research. It's very impressive. Okay. Just a couple more sort of age specific questions, a couple more nuances. What about children? I always feel like a very good mom when my kids say, I didn't eat my protein. That's why I'm not feeling good. You mentioned hormonally, when we're younger, it's not nearly as critical. And yet, of course, it's also the building block for so many things, muscle and much more, as you've articulated. So what kind of dosing should we be targeting as parents for kids?
Yes. Great question. And we don't do a lot of research on children. Because we can't muscle biopsy, we can't put them in a metabolic ward. But I will tell you that their turnover and anabolic propensities are very high because they're still growing. So they don't need the same kind of dose-dependent stimulation as adults. They can have an anabolic response from 5 to 10 grams of protein. I never worry about the dosing response for children. And again, we just don't do a ton of studies on them. The current recommendation is 2.2 grams per kg. Again, it's difficult for kids to even get that much, but they will eat as long as you provide them with good quality proteins. Then I think that they'll eat them. But to your specific question, when it comes to the science, they do not need a specific dosing. I will tell you a company that I absolutely love that my kids love. So there's two things that we use in our house. We use something called Everest protein, and it's a clear whey isolate that's almost like a juice, but it's not a juice. There's no carbs, but it's flavored really well. We love that for our kids. Watermelon, orange, because it is really challenging to get kids. They're picky eaters. So that works really well. And then we use some company called Paleo Valley, and we have gone through a million different beef sticks, right? A million different flavors, a million different things. And my kids really like this company called Paleo Valley.
That's wonderful. I can say, just based on experience that, as a parent, just their emotional regulation, everything changes when they have had sufficient protein, and probably partly because they're then not just loading up on the carbohydrates. You mentioned the protein, like the whey isolates, and I want to talk about the protein powders, protein bars, because that can be really helpful. And is there a dose at which we should be cautious? We don't want people just subsiding. We already clarified real food first. So are there sort of numbers that we should be paying attention to in our clients' diets where it's like, okay, this is actually getting to be way too much?
We don't have that answer. I can't give you that answer from an academic perspective, but here's what I can tell you. I can tell you that I'd much rather have them be getting their protein. So let's say an individual is a very busy person and the choices are highly processed foods. Are protein powders and bars highly processed? Yes. However, we still have to understand that we do live in a very fast-paced environment and we are going to be eating processed foods. It's just the way that it is. Both foods that I told you that I choose for my family, whether it's Paleo Valley or Everest, are all processed. I don't think that we have that number. And I think that, again, when I was running a weight management clinic, we actually had them do 2 shakes in a bar and then another meal, and they all improve body composition. So the hierarchy of importance, number one, is I would focus on getting the body recomposition first. Once an individual has the body recomposition, then I think you then begin to kind of take away and then replace whole foods. And it's tricky, right? But that's how I would do it personally.
That makes a lot of sense. With the grand popularity of all these GLP-1 drugs, how, if we have clients on them, most of the practitioners here are not prescribing, so they're not working with that, but they will run into situations where clients are on these products from other practitioners. And of course, we know that one of the big downsides of that is muscle loss. And so are there ways and strategies that we can use to prevent that? Recognizing, I don't want to get into a debate about these compounds, because it's a big debate and they can be life-saving for some people. How can we support clients who are in that kind of a situation to ensure that they don't lose muscle mass and they're able to eat their protein?
This is a really good question. And I've looked at the mechanisms. There's no specific mechanism of action from the GLP-1 agonist or the dual agonist GIP, like a trizepatide versus an Ozempic or semaglutide, that affects skeletal muscle in a negative way. So the reason that individuals are losing skeletal muscle mass is from the inactivity and the restriction of overall calories and dietary protein. The way to combat that is simply by increasing dietary protein, cutting back on the dose of these medications, and using a shake or something like that to get the protein in. But one has to recognize that exercise is a much more potent stimulus than protein. You cannot just eat protein and stimulate tissue. Hypothetically speaking, you can, but when we look at bed rest studies, an individual, even on a higher protein diet, it will be protein sparing, muscle sparing for the first 7 days, but after that, it's just simply not enough. They have to be moving.
I think that is a great question to, and I mean, I think we could also talk with you all day. I want to ask, just to summarize everything here, if you were to just give the top takeaway for the practitioners here in this audience, either watching or listening later on, what specifically do you want them to walk away with and immediately implement in their clinical practice?
The first thing is very simple. It's prioritizing dietary protein first, recognizing I don't actually care the source. Let's not care about, I mean, I am biased to high quality nutrient dense sources, but if that is not feasible, understanding that high quality protein is the way to go. You can change someone's trajectory of aging. The reason I chose nutrition first is because 100% of people eat. So you have to get that piece right. However, resistance training is a much more potent stimulus to skeletal muscle and the protection of aging. You are not going to simply improve skeletal muscle insulin resistance by eating dietary protein. You do need to train. And resistance training, again, I worked on some of these early studies in the early 2000s, and we had postmenopausal women doing 5 days a week of walking and 2 days a week of yoga. And they were able to go through body recomposition. That's amazing. So number one, dietary protein, because everybody eats. Number two, non-negotiable resistance training. And then number three, and this is also for the provider, is that human beings are consistent. The places in which they fail are consistent. The places in which their old habits creep up are consistent. Understanding where you fall short and planning for it instead of being surprised by it every time it happens is critical. Whether you're a provider, whether you are a patient, knowing where you fail and counteracting that failure in advance is, I mean, I can give you the best tools in the world, but if you don't know where you fail as a provider or a patient, then nothing is going to change.
Excellent. Such helpful wisdom. Where can people find more information? And I did see a teaser about a provider program. I know that that's not ready yet, but can people get on your wait list? And do you have a sense of timing?
Yes, you can certainly email. So you can go and you can sign up on the website. We also have a community that individuals can sign up for. You can always contact the practice and get put on a wait list for a provider course. We actually have the whole course shot. and done, but there's a lot to a provider course. You can listen to my podcast, the Dr. Gabrielle Lyon Show. I always bring on vetted experts to discuss things. You can find our newsletter. Our newsletter is free. Our YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all of it. Yeah. And then my book.
If you if you don't have this already, this book is it is such an incredible resource, an absolute must read, and really good to recommend to clients as well. So so consider that. A lot of the education, a lot of the strategies, it'll do a really good job of helping them to understand the critical importance of both the dietary consumption of protein and, of course, getting out and actually lifting heavy things. Dr. Lyon, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Same. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.